So now we are at the point of trying to take a look at the proposals that are on the table and get a general sense of whether or not it's going to take a lot of discussion or not much discussion to get us to consensus today. So the first proposal was made by Annie, and that proposal I'm going to try to make the decision on, like I said, in two little bits. So the first part of the proposal would be that that as Occupied Peterborough, we do an outreach table, I believe next weekend, at the Reframe Film Festival, which is a film festival focused on political documentaries. Could I get a temperature check on that idea? I see mostly twinkling fingers in the sky. Are there any lukewarm feelings? Anybody who disagrees? Any blocks?
I just have a question. There was a cost involved, like what you mentioning, like usually $25.
Yeah, he said it was typically a minimum of $25 donation from people that want to do this, but they said they would waive it. However, I suggest that we do, I mean, I'd be happy to give $25 just because I mean, in this festival.
Okay, so the question related to the cost, and it sounds like there is a minimum suggested donation of $25, but that folks might be willing to pay that. Are there any other questions, points of clarification?
The Peterborough Action Network that was meeting through the summer has a surplus of $7, and they're happy to put it towards
Getting richer every day. Any other questions of clarification on this first part of this proposal? Joe?
I'd like to suggest that perhaps on our way out, if we could get some kind of a, maybe you've got something, some kind of a container, people could just throw some tunis in or loonies or whatever, if you feel comfortable with that.
We can bring one in. Do you want to pass it around, or should we put it back?
Well, maybe the more subtle would be just to have it somewhere where people could either do it or not.
You can dump the one in the button bag and give that money to Brian and Miles and use it.
Okay, Miles?
Do we have content for a table?
Yeah.
That's part two.
This is a good question.
Well, maybe as a point of clarification, just, I mean, I'm sure we're getting into it, but I know the schedule for the film fests are pretty tight. There's usually multiple ones showing it. So I'm a bit wondering whether we'll have people willing to staff this at all times.
Question of staffing, from experience at the film festival previously, the culture or the atmosphere is that if the table isn't staffed for particular periods of time, you just leave the table there.
Mm-hmm.
And people want to buy and pick things up. So if it's a question of losing something, I don't think you have to worry about that. And other tables are left unstaffed for periods of time.
Any other questions of clarification? It seems like we have a general vibe towards wanting to do this. And so that brings us sort of to the second part of this, which is it possible? It sounds like it might be financially possible. It also sounds like if we're not at the table all the time, or if we don't have staffing for the table all the time, that there still is a good opportunity to leave some information or whatever. So can I get, I guess, sort of a general temperature check? This would involve Friday till Sunday, so a whole weekend. Can we get a temperature check on whether or not people think that there's the energy there to be able to staff this? It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be at the table. It means, do you think that we can get enough people to do this as a group?
I think the major concern is the information that's going to be out there. If we're going to make a consensus to do this, we need to get a consensus on who's going to develop something to put there.
I think in terms of process, it is true that there's a couple decisions that we're going to make in a little bit that will in some way impact and affect this particular decision. in terms of the last sort of temperature check we just took, there was definitely some enthusiasm, a good chunk of enthusiasm, and then some folks who definitely had some in-between fingers and even a couple pointed down below. So if people are okay with it, although I like to go proposal by proposal, if we can move on to the other ones and come back to this one at the tail end once we've discussed, for instance, this document and whether or not the outreach committee is empowered and mandated by this General Assembly to kind of be that voice. Maybe we'll have a bit clearer of a decision to make on the tail end. Is that all right with folks in general?
Point of information, Jeff?
I'm just wondering why we don't do it right now. It's not a big deal.
We might have to wait for the messaging proposal to be confirmed before we decide what goes on that.
Messaging?
Yeah.
We have two other proposals
That are relevant?
that are
Okay,
relevant.
sorry.
One relates to whether or not the outreach committee has a general mandate from the GA
Okay, sorry.
to be sort of the voice of
Okay.
Occupy, and the other relates to this particular document and whether or not we're gonna have anything on the
sorry.
table.
Yep, good point, thank you.
Okay, so we then move on to the second proposal that was made, which was a proposal made by James, who brought an announcement and a bit of interesting information about a workshop happening next weekend in Toronto related to Indigenous perspectives on the Occupy movement.
Actually, this Monday.
Oh, this Monday.
This Monday, the 23rd.
Okay. So we'll try to get all the announcement stuff right for the end for the notes and stuff. But the primary proposal that was made was that we, from this point forward, ensure that all of the documents, all of the whatever we put out there, have a cohesive way of naming ourselves. And the proposal at hand is that we use Occupy, parentheses, ED, parentheses, Peterborough, consistent. So, can I get a general temperature check on how people feel about that? Okay, I think we're definitely gonna have to have some discussion. And before we get into people's thoughts back and forth on that, are there any simple questions of clarification or points of information that people wanna throw in?
Are we the only Occupy group that will be using that particular form, Occupy? Are there other Occupy groups using the same?
Not that I know of.
Matt, do you know?
Yeah, if I can speak for a moment, just where the history of occupied Peterborough came from, where we came up with that name. Prior to the first General Assembly, there was a group of people kind of working on trying to get this whole thing organized, get that first General Assembly going. And one of the discussions we had at the time was around the name. And at the time, we had reached a consensus. Again, this is pre-first General Assembly, but we had reached a consensus at that point that we would use the bracket, ED bracket, to signify our solidarity with Indigenous peoples, recognizing that Canada is stolen, colonized land. We were trying to find a good name that would still have that occupied brand without, so people would know what they're getting into, what they're being involved with. So there were a few different names thrown around. We went with the Occupied Peterborough one because it is something that has been used by a few other groups. I know there's some organizing done trying to link a lot of the Canadian occupied movements that call themselves Occupied Canada, which is actually where I borrowed the name from. But there are other cities throughout North America who are using similar name changes. So there's an unoccupied somewhere, I can't remember specifically which city, and unoccupied, there's occupy / decolonize. So I think the idea behind what we had suggested at that time, it has kind of permeated throughout a lot of spots. There hasn't been one specific name that has started to be picked up and used by all of them. So we chose this one because we thought it would be the best to respect both aspects. So that's that.
Okay, are there any more points of information that people want to put on the table before we have a bit of a discussion about how we feel about this?
Occupy was originally like, it was Adbus was saying Occupy Wall Street on this day. So the fact that that network or groups were formed from that name is kind of coincidental, or just because they didn't pick anything else. That's what they were doing. It's an action, right? Occupy is a tactic that we kind of have used, but haven't really, we'll have to work on that to see if we actually want to occupy anything. So yeah, it makes sense to do that personally.
Any other points of information or direct clarification before we have a bit of a discussion about this?
Just really briefly, as far as I understand, the Occupy Wall Street movement came out of a lot of opposition to the capitalist economic system, but the occupied folks, they recognize that the colonial system is an economic system that capitalism is working within. So colonialism in itself is an economic system like capitalism that's being opposed.
So we have about an hour left, and there's a few things today that I think actually are going to take some time for discussion. And I hope that we can get through as many of them as possible, and we really do want to hear as many people's voices. Up until now, we've mostly had it pretty easy in that we haven't had to have many discussions that had much dispute. This will change our timeline just a little bit, so if people just want to, remember that we might not actually resolve everything on this list today, and that we kind of got to pick our battles. That said, I would say that the name that we go forward with is something that the General Assembly and not a committee needs to kind of come up with. And so maybe we can try to spend no more than the next 10 to 15 minutes at most having discussion about this. And then if we have a temperature check and see that there's still a lot of discussion to have, we can put it over to another GA, or we can make the decision at that point to basically put down the rest of today's agenda to make that decision. Does that make sense in terms of process for folks? So, when we did the temperature check on this one, there were some people who were agreeing that we use Occupy ED all the time. And then there were also some lukewarm feelings, and there was also some very dissenting feelings. So I want everybody to have a chance to actually speak to this that wishes. So instead of going back and forth between sides, I feel like maybe just doing a go-around would be the most effective way to just kind of hear each other out on this one. Is that all right in terms of process for folks? So anybody who wants to be the enthusiastic beginning to this discussion, please. And then we'll go to the left, always the left.